All right, if I can have everybody's attention real quick. We're going to go ahead and get started second presentation. So let's give it up for Adrian.
All right, so my name is Adrian Bettridge-Wiese. That's W-I-E-S-E, Larry. Wiese, like we see, you don't pronounce it as the Germans would. So I'm the Chief Operations Officer at 2Inc., which is a very small consulting firm, technically based in Champaign. I am the only actual employee in Champaign. Matthew is here. He's based in Mahomet. We have one person in Cleveland, one person in Manitou Springs, Colorado, and one person who moved from Jamaica to Toronto, which seems absolutely insane to me, but I think it was about love. So when I originally gave this talk at WebCon, it was called Strengthening Teams Through Decision-Making Frameworks, because I couldn't make any programming jokes because I didn't want just programmers to come. Unfortunately, you are all really geeky, and so I get to make lots of bad jokes. So I got into software through a very rational path. I have a bachelor's degree in music and a master's degree in human resources. I went from classical music to human resources, classical music to academic publishing, and now finally software development. And my job is similarly scattershot. So like I said, there are only 5 of us, and I basically do a lot of stuff. I do front-end programming. I also send invoices to our clients and pay payroll. And throughout my entire Quixotic career, basically, I've been in roles where I focus a lot on process and structure. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Basically, applying the same rigor that we hypothetically have while we're making software to the way that we make decisions. So to get us started, I want to talk about what I think makes for good decision-making. There's no really one universal definition, but I did go to school for human resources, so I had to take an entire class about it. I do think it requires 4 things. 1, decisions are made with input from your whole team. 2, everyone on the team has an equal voice. 3, conflict occurs without harm. And finally, every member of the team is committed to all of these. And it sounds simple, and we all know that it's not. It sort of brings me to my next point, which is that people are bad at things. So our brains are really fascinating machines that we do not understand at all. And as developers, I think we're all particularly subject to one logical fallacy which says this: I am a rational creature, therefore the decisions that I make are rational. However, that's not true. Most of the things that you do are just things that your brain decided on the spur of the moment, or actually decided ahead of time and then did. Like when you hit your elbow and you say, ouch, even though it didn't hurt, that's a pre-programmed pathway in your brain that's just fired. Right? That's not rational. And there is so much going on in our brains that it is really easy to miss things that we're supposed to be paying attention to and to pay attention to the things that we're doing. And it's why I like process. A lot of this, the reason I want to put frameworks into place for decisions is that I want to game against our own intensely fallible natures. So when I talk about decision-making frameworks with muggles, I explain that they're a formal process for making decisions. And I talk about Robert's Rules of Order, and I talk about collective bargaining. For you all, it's just software development. You can just think of them like functions. So for me, their goals boil down to 3 things: ensuring representation and fairness, coming to the best decision under the circumstances, and avoiding making process up on the fly. As I said, this is really, you can think of them like functions. And so we're gonna start having a bunch of really bad fake JavaScript here to do that. So I'm gonna talk a bit about what decision-making most often looks like. Meet Bedelia, Stella, Chad, and Dana. From here on out, these are our subjects, and we're going to be talking about this group of people who, for some reason, get paid to hold speech balloons above their heads. This is my absolute favorite piece of stock photography I have ever found. I abuse it, and I apologize if you've seen me talk ever, because it's in almost every talk. So I'm going to start with an extremely basic representation of a participant in a discussion, and this is a JavaScript class. It's got a name and an opinion, and a constructor, because otherwise it wouldn't work. And they've got just 3 methods. Consider, which combines their opinion with an outside opinion. Brain stuff goes there. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to write an artificial intelligence function there. So speak, which just spits out their opinion. It's one thing we're all pretty reliably good at. And listen, which takes someone else's opinion and sends it in for consideration. This one we'll talk about later. So I'm going to set up an array here with some opinions that don't really need to be explored. So we got our opinions set up, we got our participants in an array. And if we were a nice ordered program, this might be what our conversation looks like. Everybody talks, everyone else listens. We, however, are not a nice ordered program, and we're actually very bad at listening. So I'm gonna update that listen method on the class real quick to be a little more realistic. So now we're looking at a 50-50 chance of actually listening, and most of the time, you know, they're going to look like it. And you never really know if somebody's actually listening to you or is just, you know, doing whatever your brain is doing. So we're also really bad at letting people talk. So I'm going to go ahead and take the better shot at speak method here. So now anytime somebody speaks, they're going to get between no words and everything they wanted to say out. I learned after I did this that actually Lodash has just a words function. So I could have skipped this. I'm sure this is right. I can't imagine there's any problem with just splitting it every space. So now we've got all of those. And I want to just like revisit the representation of a participant in the class. There is an argument that I should have split up that I should have split up listen by word also rather than just being random, but that seems like feature creep, otherwise known as I didn't want to remake this slide. So it's really messy, and it's going to get worse because the list of things that we are bad at also includes any sort of orderly discussion. You probably remember that for each function, and I would say that that's at best aspirational. So this is a little more realistic depiction of how discussions tend to go. And can somebody tell me what the problem is here? It never ends. Well, it does actually when your JavaScript execution engine crashes, right? Which is actually a pretty good representation of how a lot of conversations go. Random people talk, some amount of their opinion gets out, eventually it all breaks down and you do something, right? And what that something is where I really like to talk about decision-making frameworks. See, if you don't make a decision about how you're going to do something, you fall back on how we have done some things for a very long time. And those are sort of hidden decision-making frameworks, and they have serious issues. So let's look at Bedelia, Stella, Chad, and Dana again. If I were to tell you that this group was going to have a discussion and come to a decision, I suspect that most of you have an instinctive sense for who is going to get his way. And I meant to say his, because it's Chad, right? The default way that we have of making decisions is the accumulated craft of millennia of dominance by people who look like me and act like me. And that means that all of those things, they entrench those power structures. That is bullshit. If the whitest, malest, loudest, and most aggressive person in your group is always getting their way, then you don't have a team, right? You have a dictatorship. And that is completely contrary to the things I set out at the beginning that make strong teams. And it's why I want you to think about using a framework for how you make decisions, so you don't fall back on these bad patterns. Now, if you look like me, this line of thinking is going to feel uncomfortable. And you might even feel like I'm attacking you, and I get that. I'm sorry if that's uncomfortable. But it's pretty important. Benefiting from entrenched power structures doesn't actually make you a bad person, right? It just means you have privilege. And if you have privilege, I think it's your responsibility to use that privilege to level the playing field so that other people don't have that same disadvantage that you experienced, or rather that you enjoyed, right? And that's why I get to talk too, because I don't think it's the responsibility of people without privilege to try to fix this. But it's not the only reason. Like I mentioned before, I am a consultant, and yes, I'm the annoying kind of consultant who gets paid to tell you that you're doing things wrong. So I've spent a bunch of time in meetings with people where nothing happened. I have been in meetings that went all day and cost $10,000+ because they were filled with executives in Silicon Valley, where nothing happened. Just literal nothing. All we did was talk for an entire day, and then we got tired of the fluorescent lights and went out drinking, right? And the reason it happened is there was no structure. Frequently, people didn't even understand that they were going to be making a decision, let alone what it was going to look like. The whole situation sucks a lot, right? It's frustrating, it disenfranchises people, it wastes time, and it wastes money. And I want to try to ameliorate some of that by using a framework for the decision making. So where are these most appropriate? Well, anytime you know in advance that you're going to be making a decision, it's worth thinking about how you make that decision. And it's doubly true if it's the sort of thing you're going to be doing a lot, right? Don't reinvent the wheel every time. I'll give you an example. So I'm a mentor at the University of Illinois Leadership Program. So every semester I get paired with a couple of kids, which is a sort of horrifying moment when you realize you're working with people you can legitimately call young people. And so one of the kids that I worked with, he was having trouble because in his chemistry lab, he and his lab partner were running out of time to finish their work in the class. And the reason it happened is they could never agree when they should call the TA for help. Instead, they said, oh no, we're almost there. I think I got it, we're almost there. And they run out of time. So they didn't have a shared definition of what it meant to be stuck. They didn't have a guideline that says, like, this is what it means to be stuck. So every time they're renegotiating, are we stuck or not? Given that they were experiencing a time crunch, the framework that they needed to work under was just an n-minute situation. We were working on this for 5 minutes, we called the TA, right? It doesn't matter if you think you're almost there. Just call the TA, get the help, and move on. That way, they're still making progress. So how do you actually make one of these things? Well, your first instinct is probably just to start at the very beginning, but I actually think we're going to tell Julie Andrews to take a hike. So because when you're creating a framework, I really recommend working backwards. Understand what the product of your decision will be first. You can think of it sort of like writing a test for your decision making. Once you know what the outcome of your decision should look like, then you can make sure the process to get there is yielding the right kind of decision. So is it a yes or no answer? Or is it something quantitative, like a score, right? Those are two vastly different situations. And understanding what the outcome looks like gives you a lot of process-related insight. If it's a yes or no, you might be looking at a majority rule sort of situation. And if you need a score, well, maybe you're going to take an average. But in both of those cases, I used a lot of wiggle words, and I did that on purpose because you need to put more thought into it than just saying, oh, we just average it. So it skips a lot of thinking that's really useful. So for my number nerds out there, first of all, average is only one of several measures of central tendency, and median and mode are both really cool. And there's also a question if you're using arithmetic or geometric averages. If you're not that much of a geek, there's a question of what you do about outliers, right? So a lot of statistical analysis chops a bunch of outliers off and takes in the middle, but you lose a lot when you start to do that. Think about your Scrum teams where you're estimating story difficulty, right? If you chop the outliers, you would never know the people who had spotted landmines or spotted the tricks. So you may really, we just take the average is too easy. Likewise, simple majority is not always enough for a decision, right? Plenty of time, 50% plus one is not enough to do something. Sometimes you might want a supermajority, or if you're on a jury, you might want to be unanimous before you say, I don't know, convict someone and send them to jail. So let's think about it coming to a yes or no decision as a function. We're going to get our array of opinions, and we're going to reduce it down to a simple majority vote. It's even easier if you need it to be unanimous, as long as you have learned, like I did, about the array.every method, which turns out to be really cool. Thank you, ES6. So what about the discussions that lead up to that decision? That's a little more complicated. And I talked about it earlier, right? You want to make sure that each person has time to talk. And basically, you want to make sure that everybody's listening. I want to force actually listening to being true. So what does it look like? Well, it's going to be different for every group. But there are a few musts that I find important. Forgot to click. And click again. There we go. So make sure that people have uninterrupted time to talk and that everybody else is forced to listen. You can't actually force people to listen, but you can require them to take notes. Taking notes makes them pay attention to the person who's talking, stops them from formulating their responses or thinking about what's for dinner, right? Make sure that you have a mechanism for staying on track. So I really like the podcast Writing Excuses, which is Brandon Sanderson's podcast. And it's a bunch of really interesting people who spend not very much time on an episode. So whenever they start to get off track, they'll say can of worms, which means, hey, this is cool, we should talk about it later. Then they get back on track. And finally, make sure that you have mechanisms to prevent filibuster. If you're in a group with me, then I will never shut up unless there are real strict limits to how much I can talk. So think about how you can use time limits to ensure that everybody gets to participate. Here's what a state opinion section might look like with a little more order imposed on it. And secretly, this is actually just a function wrapped around the thing I showed you at the beginning, which we called aspirational before, because it wasn't going to happen when people didn't have an actual structure imposed on them. And here's an updated participant class, which is going to add the notes field and go ahead and put adding to the notes in the listen method. I also, though, want to provide structure for how people ask questions. What I want to do is avoid one person feeling ganged up on, like having everybody ask the questions at once, because that's really going to disincentivize participation in the future. So instead, I want to have a dedicated period for each person to ask questions of the group, and then get the answers back from the team members. And I'm going to add some more methods to support questions. So start by adding a method that gets questions out of their notes and asks them, and that adds something that deals with the responses. But I also want to support the other side, which is, say, thinking up answers and taking a question and turning it into an answer, which now I'm going to expand that all out into a class that is going to be kind of hard to read, I suspect. So sorry for that. But this is a really concise and extremely hopeful representation of what a really ordered and perfect participant in discussion would look like. Obviously, this isn't real life, but it's nice to think about the structure of what this would look like. And here is what our Ask Questions section might look like. Each person is going to get to speak. All the people who aren't speaking are going to listen. The people who are getting questions for them are going to answer them. And the speaker gets those and then considers them, maybe even changing their opinion. And now that we have all of that, we can bring it together into a cute little function. State opinions, ask questions, return your decision. But we're almost there, because you really do need to have a way to actually make it happen, too. It does not need to be something fancy, though I was on a Scrum team where the Scrum Master had a gavel to play the Law and Order dun-dun sound, and it was amazing. Matthew remembers that. But you just need some way to say, like, hey, we're going to stop chit-chatting and actually make a decision. I call it decision time here. That's going to be an ES7 standard, I'm sure. So I've talked at length now about decision-making frameworks and how they can build a strong team. If I've done a good job, maybe you're interested in applying some of these principles to your own teams, and I want to talk about making that happen. And yes, I do have to acknowledge that despite calling it functional decision-making, I do no functional programming here. I looked at it and I was like, this seems hard and I don't want to work on it that long. So when you want to put something into place, don't try to do everything at once, right? Pick one single entry point. And remember how I said, like, hey, something that you do a lot, that's a good place to start. Start there. For example, if you were trying to develop a plan for how to estimate sprint stories, right? That'd be one way to do it. That'd be a good entry place to do that every 2 weeks. Or if you can never agree with your lab partner on when to call the TA. So it is important to have an idea of what a framework might look like, but don't come to your team with a fully formed plan. Obviously, this needs to be a collaborative thing. You cannot impose it on them. What I do think you should do is present your idea something like this. Hey, I noticed we spend a lot of time making the same kind of decision over and over again. I learned about decision-making frameworks from a very handsome and intelligent conference presenter, and here's why I think that decision-making frameworks are so cool. By the way, I barely remember to change that from CUJS from WebCon. It was about 10 minutes before I left the house. Whew. So experience to me suggests that the hardest part of this is going to be getting people over the hump of sort of entering an artifice of a framework when they're used to a free-for-all. I find, a lot like I've done today, it's good to sort of show where the points of commonality are, right? Like I said, I like to say Robert's Rules of Order or collective marketing. You all get to say, hey, it's just functional decision-making. I didn't make up the joke. Don't be mad at me, right? Past that, though, you do have people who are going to be opposed to change or who are consciously or not fearing losing the privilege that they have. And this is where I think it's the responsibility of people who have privilege to really lead the charge. I don't like it, but people who have privilege are going to have a lot better luck getting some change like this made than people who don't. It's a great opportunity to correct the imbalances inherent in our position. So once you get one framework up and running, you want to check back in with your team to make sure that it's actually doing what you want. That's loud. Never feel like your first pass has to be perfect. You might iterate on the process or even just toss it if it isn't working out how you want it to. Of course, gathering feedback has to be as methodical as everything else. I like a structure where everybody gets a chance to say what they think went well and what didn't. If you've been on a sprint team, that probably sounds familiar. As a group, talk through the issues and figure out what you might do to change them. And then I honestly recommend changing things. Experimentation is the only way that you're going to learn what works best for your group. I cannot tell you what's going to be best. Even if you come and pay me to do it, which I would be happy to, but every group is going to be different, and you just have to really twist the knobs until you figure it out. If you are the manager of your team, you might think that this is going to be easier. And I apologize now if this sounds like Management 101, but you would be incorrect. You cannot actually just use your unitary power to impose this on your group. You have to have buy-in or the process is going to fall apart and everybody's going to hate you even more than they did before you did that, because certainly you have been doing that before. What you need to do is make sure that you've explained the process just like I did before. Here's what they are, here's why we should use them, handsome and intelligent conference presenter, et cetera, et cetera. But you do have one more significant responsibility, and that is making sure that you have the health of your team in mind and making sure that your team understands that you do. So they need to understand how the process is going to be iterated on, and they need to make sure that you need to make sure that they believe that that you're looking out for their best interest, not just say for your career because, oh, you like boss, I did this cool thing for my team, right? That's going to be a failure. Your first responsibility always has to be with the health of your team. Now, all of this is well and good, but as Helmut von Moltke the Elder said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And in this case, we are the enemy. When you start trying to follow any sort of framework like this, it is inevitable that you will do it wrong. And if that happens, all you need to do is call a timeout as soon as you notice. From there, start by forgiving yourself, because the whole reason I got into this, the whole reason I've been talking about this, is that we are intensely fallible creatures. And this is just one of the many ways that this is going to show itself on a day-to-day basis. The most important thing is recognizing that you got off track and stopping any further derailment. Then you just pick up where you left off. If that means that you're going to hear from somebody again because they spoke out of turn, that's fine. We have a process in place that we follow, and sometimes it means that things feel a little unnatural, but it's in the interest of a better goal. However, sometimes these derailments will not be accidental. And in that case, make sure that you curtail that person's behavior, whatever it is, immediately, and call out why you're doing so. The people on your team need to see that the team's commitment to the decision framework is serious. Otherwise, the people who need it most, people who are marginalized, are going to end up wondering if it's actually there for them. In some situations, there may even need to be consequences for the person's behavior. For teams with a hierarchy built in, you can ship that right off to your manager as their responsibility. But if you're on a non-hierarchical team, you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do within your group. So one pretty common thing that goes wrong in these situations is that somebody will not shut up and will not stop talking over other people. This is where I like a swear jar. You interrupt somebody, put $1 in the jar. If the jar fills up, you get a pizza party. If you're feeling generous or you just want to ease into this, start with Monopoly money, but make people hand it over, and don't let your forgiveness be endless. There is something that I don't want you to do, though, except under the most extreme circumstances, and it's have consequences that alienate someone from your group by excluding them from decision-making. The idea here is to create an environment of fairness and collaboration, and excluding someone is basically the worst way to do that. It is a lot more likely to me that someone should just not be on your team than should be regularly having to be silenced. Now, obviously, you're not always going to have control over that, but do think hard before you start to make a decision like this. So if there's one thing that you take away from this talk, I want you to think about the amount of influence that you have over how your groups function. So I laid out at the beginning my components for good decision making. I just want to pull them back up one more time. Decisions should be made with input from the whole group. Everyone should have an equal voice in those decisions. Conflict should occur without harm, and the entire team should be engaged in achieving these goals. If you act with intention, these goals are all very achievable. All it takes is a willingness to step outside of the hidden decision frameworks that we operate under and start to create your own that are focused on fairness and representation. If you want to talk more about decision-making, you can reach me by email or phone or at 2Waves Twitter, which is basically dormant, so I will definitely see if you at me. The slides are up at tinyurl.com/2wavescugs. And regardless of whether you put any of this into practice, I hope that you'll think about what the frameworks you operate under look like and whether they are perpetuating the status quo or fighting against it. Thanks.